Oh, hello, and welcome to my tour of my little guitar collection, which you'll probably gather very soon if you didn't know already is an obsession with me. I don't just play them, I absolutely love them, and for all sorts of reasons. So let's just have a look in there. This is where they all are. This was a garage when we first moved here, but we already had one of our three children playing piano, and then as a couple of years went by, they were bringing home oboes and bassoons and trombones and all sorts of things. Apart from, of course, the two or three guitars I had. So this is the ex-garage, and it was then and still is a music room. So it's just a quick glance around the room. You can see it's not just about guitars. There's lots of books there, a few jigsaw puzzles, lots of records. All these are catalogues and books about guitars, and then there's the collection itself. I don't just collect them; I play them. But I'm fascinated by guitars because I think it's not just how they're made and what I can do with them. It's I really am convinced that they reflect so many things about the society that existed when each one was made. And we're going back to sort of 15th century, 14th, 15th century, and they changed over the centuries. And I don't think there are many other things that reflect so well, apart from maybe buildings, what was going on in society at the time. If you have a look on my website, andrewbazeley.com, there is a guitars page, and within that page there is one section which is my guitars, and it's most of these ones you can see now. If you click on them, you'll get a little YouTube clip of me playing it. But then there's another page which is a very, very long and self-indulgent history of guitars. So what I'm going to tell you today is only a tiny little summary of what's in that. So I'm going to talk about all these guitars, hopefully historically. So we'll start with the oldest. And there's this gorgeous little thing that I've not had very long, but I've always wanted one. And this was made in about 1820, a couple hundred years ago. And it was made in Mirecourt in northern France, which became one of the centres of not just guitar making, but violin making and also lace making. It wasn't just France, it was Austria, it was Portugal, it was Spain, it was Britain, which a couple hundred years ago were making these kind of guitars. But it was a kind of transition period because for about 200 years, guitars had been really decorative instruments. They were played in palaces and courts and in high society, and they were beautifully made, and they had lots of mother of pearl and ivory. They weren't very well made. The wood they were made of wasn't very resonant, which of course guitars have to be. It's the resonance of the timbre on the top of the guitar that produces the tone and the sound. They were really poorly strung. They were so quiet and so unable to sort of make any kind of presence that they had to double up all the strings. So you'd have maybe 5 sets of strings, or courses as they used to call them, to give them any volume at all, which of course made them twice as hard to play and press the strings down. They didn't have proper frets, these bits up there that you put your fingers on. They just had tie-on catgut strings. Everything was very, very highly decorative. And they're known now as Baroque guitars. But around about 1800, people started realising that guitars were actually pretty interesting instruments. You could actually do things with them. So around about that time, people sort of settled on a shape and a size and a level of decoration. But they had to be easier to play and make a much bigger noise. And so they settled on this kind of structure whereby you had 6 strings and you had these kind of push-in pegs, and then the strings were tied on at the bottom end, and it was all fairly rigid and firm, and the frets were evenly spaced so that they would actually play accurately. And later on these became known as parlour guitars, which kind of reflects the history of them being played in rather nice houses and palaces and things. But they were much more playable, still very decorative. So we're around about sort of 1800, 1820, around about that kind of period. but they were being made all over Europe. And one of the places that kind of settled on this kind of design was, of course, Spain. And Spain became really the sort of focal point of guitar production. And what happened around 1850, 1860, there was a maker in Spain called Antonio de Torres, and he kind of settled on this particular design, and it was based on this parlor size. And they decided on nylon strings as being the best, the pegs that go through, fixed at one end, winding round pegs at the other end, made of very, very nice wood. And they were very reliable guitars. This one was made in 1905. It was made by Jose Ramirez the First. At the moment we're on Ramirez the Fourth. It's still in the same family. They produce a lot more now. But in those days this was one of their very early guitars. So you know it's 1905 because he's actually signed it inside with the date on it. And this is what's commonly known now as a Spanish guitar. So Spain was the kind of focal point of defining this sort of guitar. Fairly small body, beautiful wood, beautiful sound. Most of them had these straight through pegs, like violin pegs, just a piece of wood that was shoved through a hole. What I love about this one is that some of these very early flamenco guitars had a hole drilled in the top, and which meant you could hang them up. And there's a very famous painting. I can't remember what the name of the bloke is. Hang on a sec. Let me just see if I can find out who it was. Yeah, a British painter called John Singer Sargent. He did a famous painting of flamenco dancing, and you can actually see these guitars hanging up on the wall. So that was clearly fairly standard to have this hole. So this one's 1905, and it kind of summed up that important role that Spain had in defining what guitars should look and sound like around that time. But they weren't the only ones. They were made all over Europe. There's another one here which is probably even older. It doesn't look much. This one, the label inside says Cincordi Hermanos, which I think means the Cincordi brothers. Now I don't know much about this one. Cincordi made guitars between 1860 and around 1900. So there's no way of telling how old this one actually is. There's no date on it. They were normally quite decorative, a little bit more decorative than these very basic flamenco ones. But this one has no decoration at all, and it's quite small. I suspect it was maybe a student guitar, maybe a kid's guitar or a beginner's guitar. I don't think it was anything special. But the next thing we need to talk about is most guitars were being made in European countries, but of course what happened to a lot of European guitar makers? Well, they went to America and settled in America. And towards the end of the 19th century, there was a big boom in America. There was so much demand for musical instruments, and there were so many immigrant musicians and builders and craftsmen, and quite a lot were actually beginning to make very, very nice guitars. The banjo was very popular, the mandolin was very popular around about 1900, and the guitar was just beginning to become a very popular instrument. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. But I just want to show you these two. I mean, these were, if you look at the shape of these, they're not that different to that really old one. And therefore they acquired this nickname of parlour guitars. This is about when that term got applied. But these two are sort of opposite examples of how these things were produced. The one on the right here was pretty much mass produced by a company called Lyon and Healy. They were British, or their children were British immigrants. And they called this one the Washburn. They christened their guitars Washburns. They were mass produced, they were made in a big factory. Washburn was the middle name of one of them. I don't know whether it was Lyon or Healy. And they just made these fine guitars. And it was prompted by another company called Martin, Charles Friedrich Martin, who came over and started his company in 1833. He was an apprentice with a great Austrian maker called Johann Stauffer. I nearly bought a Stauffer a few years back, and I'd have doubled my money by now if I had, but I really couldn't afford it. But Martin was one of his apprentices, and he came over to the States, and in 1833 he formed the Martin Guitar Company, and he started making very, very good quality using the skills he learned from Stauffer. And what happened after that, they were quite expensive, but you've got these companies like Line and Healy who just tried to meet the demand by making much, much cheaper versions. So they're trying to emulate Martins, but on a much, much cheaper scale. This other one is a little bit different because it wasn't just the big companies like Line and Healy that were trying to mass produce these guitars, but you got these sort of small firms, and again, mostly Europeans. And one of them was that formed this company called Harwood. Now, the name of the family, let me just check. I have to check these things. I've got notes of some of this. I can't remember everything, you know. I do try. Yeah, Jenkins. It was the Jenkins family. And I think they started in Boston, but they moved to Kansas City. But the funny thing is that they, all their labels said New York, because they thought that would sell the guitars. They thought that gave them a lot of prestige if it said it was made in New York. So this is a Harwood guitar. That Washburn was probably made in 1898. This was a little earlier, probably 1985. There are no records. A lot of these factories burnt down and the records were lost. But fortunately, there is a descendant of the family who recently decided to do a bit of research and try and find leaflets and booklets and brochures and adverts from those times to try and put a bit of age and date onto a lot of these guitars. And I actually got in touch with him, and he said, yeah, this one is probably 1895. It's a very nice guitar, lovely guitar. And again, it was trying to sort of match the Martins that were sort of dominating at that time, and they set very high standards, but they were, of course, bloody expensive. So we're around about 1900 now. We're not just Europe, but America, where there was a huge demand for musical instruments, were developing this parlour guitar uniform style and just making them out of nicer woods, maybe decorating them a little bit, but trying to meet this demand at a reasonable price for musical instruments. Banjos, mandolins, ukuleles were already very popular, but the guitar was just beginning to dominate the scene. Right, let's go back along this way again, because I think we need to talk about one of the best known makers of guitars ever, and that's Gibson. There was an English chap called Orville Gibson who settled in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and he had this theory that there's no reason why you shouldn't apply the same kind of skill and artistry in making guitars as people applied to things like violins. And he could see there was a big demand, but he just had these standards. He just wanted to make things beautifully. He started making mandolins in the late 1890s probably, and the first thing he did was to change the way the mandolin was designed, because mandolins then were all Italian and they had these rounded backs, and he